China has 410 warheads. The United States has 5,224. Clearly capable. We did it back then, and it's like, whatever. We killed 20,000 innocent children when we didn't need to. Americans will be so surprised. Are you surprised? Something foul is going on. So the conflict in Israel is heating up, and we've seen in the last couple of days new headlines that U.S. forces being attacked. And of course, that's always the red flag of, all right, we're going to get drawn into this conflict in a bigger way, which of course means government funding for the war, more military aid, and forces, troops even being deployed to the area. So let's take a look at this. Now, I couldn't help making this video because I watched this 3-minute clip from NewsNation, and NewsNation is supposed to be an independent media outlet that doesn't really promote propaganda on one end or the other of the political polarization in the United States. However, this was pretty disappointing to me, and I get that they are going to, as a news channel, display all different types of viewpoints, but this just really seemed like blatant propaganda, and we're going to break it down here. We're going to look at what this individual says here about the reasons of why we're going to need to invest more in our military, and we're going to need to send support to Israel and Ukraine and continue doing that. We're going to look at how his arguments are not strong and are probably designed in a way to cleverly kind of mislead the public and make something seem like it's a serious issue and an argument for more money into military, more buildup of the military, when we break it down here, you're going to see how this is just propaganda. This is just warmongering in its most basic form. So let's see here. This headline, which I've been seeing these pop up the last 24 hours more and more. U.S. troops targeted in attack by rockets, drones in Iraq. Let's listen to the beginning here.
Now joined by retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula. He served as the Chief of Air Force Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance from 2006 to 2010. There have been all these, several attempted attacks on U.S. military personnel just in the last few days alone. How should President Biden respond to these attempts to kill our own service members who are abroad right now?
From a strategic perspective, what's at play here is that peace is only assured by strength, and the capacity of the United States to deter aggression is significantly eroded over the past 30 years. I'll give you a quick example.
Sure.
Did you know today that our Air Force is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready in its 76-year history? The youngest B-52 bomber is over 62 years old. We're flying trainers that are over 50 years old and fighters over 40. So today, the U.S. military struggles to meet demands in one theater, let alone 4. And by that, I mean defending our own homeland, what's going on in Europe, the Pacific, and now a hot war in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So
I think that'll surprise a lot of people. Yeah, I think a lot of Americans will be surprised by the facts that you just stated. Speaking of the military.
So we're going to pause it there because that's the kind of punch right there. And the average listener will probably hear that and go, wow, really? Our military, the Air Force is the smallest it's been ever. It's been declining the last 30 years. And our youngest pilots in our B-52s, whatever that means, to the average person, are 62 years old. This is nuts, right? Wow, we better get our act together. Otherwise, we're not going to be ready for World War III here. And then, of course, this reporter adds insult to injury, really, by saying, wow, I bet you a lot of Americans are going to be really surprised by those facts. Let's see. Let's see if you're surprised when we break them down. Sounds good on paper here, right? Somewhat convincing to the casual listener. But let's back it up and take this guy's claims one by one.
Peace is only assured by strength.
Peace is only assured by strength. A lot of ambiguity in that statement. What does peace look like? Is peace what has been achieved for decades and decades in the Middle East with U.S. occupation and other occupations of countries and regions? Is that peace? And what do you mean by strength? Military force, coercion? Okay, but sounds good, right? It's a lofty idea that the average person can grab onto. You can only have peace with strength. It's just the way it is, right?
The capacity of the United States to deter aggression has significantly eroded over the past 30 years.
All right, let's break that down. The capacity of the United States to deter aggression has significantly eroded over the past 30 years. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity in that statement, but let's take it. This visual can speak a lot to the argument that this individual is trying to make here. Take a look at this chart, and here's what it's showing. This is military national defense spending in billions of dollars for 2023. Okay? The United States spent $877 billion. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Britain, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and Ukraine combined spent $849 billion. So the US spent more on their military than all the other major world powers combined. Okay? So if this guy Deptula is saying that over the last 30 years, our ability just to respond or to put down aggression has eroded, um, what are we doing wrong? Because we're spending more than all the other countries combined. So what are we doing wrong? Now, deter aggression, right? We could all agree that at the very least, that the primary necessity and function of having a military is to be able to prevent or to deter aggression from other countries, right? That's like the bare minimum of why we need a military. Now, if we're spending more money than all the other major world powers and our ability to just prevent aggression against us has gone down, where is all this money going? It doesn't make sense. Has it been going to all the defense contractors that are making billions off of the American taxpayer? Probably, right? I mean, almost probably definitely, if we were to really dig in and look at the numbers and the data. And the irony of this is that this rhetoric that our military is eroding over the last 30 years, even though we're spending more than anyone, is the irony is that this is a rhetoric aimed at getting more funding and more investment into the military. And so one of the things that we would want to search up to verify if this gentleman's claims are accurate would be defense military spending from 1990 to 2020, roughly the last 30-year period. And so the top result we get here shows this. It shows how our military spending has gone up significantly from, let's say, 1993, which would be 30 years ago. It was at 316 billion, and now it's at 800. So that's obviously a major increase. It's almost tripled. It's almost tripled at this point. And under here, they're doing a little bit of a correction to showing you, okay, but what percentage is that spending of the GDP? The GDP is a number that means the total number of goods and services that were produced and sold in the country. And it's one economic indicator of many, but they're showing you, okay, what percentage of all the money of goods and services that were sold in the country, what percentage of that was spent on the military? And it was at a high, you could see here, way back in the Vietnam War era, right? Almost at 9%. And then it goes down during peacetime again, down to 5%. And then back in the Reagan era, it kind of spikes up again. Reagan, as we can see here in the chart, military spending from 1975 went from, about 90 billion, and in the Reagan years, it shot up all the way into 325 billion. So that tripled, and it was at 5.6% of the GDP. Okay, so how much has it gone down until now? Well, roughly about 2%. So the statement that our ability to defend ourselves against aggression has eroded significantly over the last 30 years, a 2% decrease of our GDP has been spent on the military, and our military spending has almost tripled. And I don't want to get too into the weeds of it, but we could go even deeper than this, because GDP as it's adjusted for inflation, has almost doubled. Adjusted for inflation, has almost doubled from 1993 to 2023, which means that the GDP is much higher. So the percentage that we spend on military, even though we're increasing military spending, the GDP is growing so much, adjusted for inflation, growing so much that, yeah, I mean, we'd have to like ridiculously increase the military spending to unprecedented levels to get that same kind of 5.6% during the 30 years ago. Okay, so we can clearly argue here military spending has not gone down over the last 30 years. It's increased. It has increased. So I'm not sure exactly what he is referring to when he says that the capacity of the United States to deter aggression has significantly eroded. I'm not sure how much it has really eroded over the last 30 years. Here we look at the map of the world and nuclear stockpiles. We can see that the US has 5,200 and Russia has a little bit more. And that's been about the same for a long time. We can see here the amount of warheads in the world. We can see that we're clearly neck and neck with Russia and ahead of China. China has 410 warheads. The United States has 5,224. Yeah, Russia has some more warheads than us, but we clearly are capable of deterring aggression from anybody. And here's the thing with the nuclear warheads, and we'll come back to this. It's a futile argument because if anybody uses them, it's what's called mutually assured destruction, which is just to say that once one uses them, the other one's going to respond. Nuclear weapons are mass destruction, so countries would just get obliterated, and they wouldn't, and it would just be back and forth, and there would just be unimaginable decimation of civilization and human beings, and then a likely afterwards. And they did the science on all this in the 50s. You can read some of the details in a book called Blank Check by Timothy Weiner. Very interesting read about when nuclear weapons were really being spearheaded and the Cold War was really being propped up in the 50s and the 60s. And they, scientists did these studies, and within the government, within the Defense Department, within the Pentagon, within the executive branch, to decide like how much do we really need to build this up. And they realized that the fallout, the after effects, even if it didn't kill everybody in the first go of a nuclear battle, the toxicity in the environment, it would be like a wipeout situation. So it's almost like pointless. It's almost pointless. And the other crazy thing is that the US has 5,000 something warheads now. When these studies were done back in the day, they determined, and you can look for yourself, you can dig into that Timothy Weiner book. I don't have the exact statistic memorized right now. You can find it there though. They figured out, okay, how many of these things do we need to be able to destroy Russia? Every city, everywhere, the whole country. And it was somewhere in the hundreds. But we went ahead and built up 5,000. We're never going to use these. Never going to use these. Now, this connects to the other part of this guy's argument. My point here was to say I think we have ample evidence to show that we are clearly capable of deterring aggression. And that has not eroded over the last 30 years. And if it has, then something unimaginable is going on, because we're spending more money than all the other countries combined. And we've increased our spending exponentially over the last 30 years. So if our ability to deter aggression has really eroded over the last 30 years, something foul is going on here. And that is a bigger issue than all of this, more of a domestic issue than a foreign issue. Now, next he says he goes to give his evidence, his examples. Let's hear them.
I'll give you a quick example.
Sure.
Did you know today that our Air Force is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready in its 76-year history?
Our Air Force is the oldest, smallest, and least ready in its 76-year history. Now, we're gonna look at oldest and smallest. We're not gonna touch least ready because that is an overly ambiguous term. We have no idea what metrics and what criteria is being used to determine what does it mean to be ready, and how are we judging least ready. So at best, we're taking this guy's word for it. We're the least ready to respond to a threat right now. But we can try to find data on oldest and smallest. Now, interestingly enough, his fact is accurate. it is actually the smallest number of active enlistees in the armed forces. Look at this chart. This is the combined U.S. military personnel. Air Force actually has the most of all of the branches. And if we go back here to 1954, of course, this is, unfortunately, I couldn't find a nice chart like this that goes back in through the 40s to World War II. But obviously, World War I, World War II, huge, massive war. The whole country was rallied to go to everyone who was anybody of a man went and fought for his country in World War II. So yeah, of course, in the aftermath of that and the height of the Cold War propaganda, we had numbers that were at almost 1,947,000 in the Air Force. And that gradually goes down, dips back up when? Oh, during the Vietnam War, where there was a forced draft and it was a massacre of American soldiers for an unjust war, which was years later proven to be started on a 100% false flag impetus. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where they said that a U.S. ship had been sunken, attacked by Viet Cong forces and sunken, it was totally not true. It was totally made up. That was verified years later. And we were drawn into the war on that. And now after the Vietnam War, understandably, it dips down, okay, to like half of that from the post-war era. And then in the 80s, it kind of, 80s, 90s, Reagan era kind of stays the same. And then we have this, this big dying down. And we can see that the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is the symbolic end of the Soviet Union, who was our big enemy, right? And the whole Gorbachev and post 1988 into the 90s, that whole time was like, okay, Russia and the West are friendly now. Russia was the big threat. Russia was the whole drive behind, fighting against communists and building up our military, building up our nuclear warheads. So, of course, throughout the Cold War era, the 50s to the late 80s, we hovered around, 900, 500,000, dipping and going up, of course. So why did we come down this much here? Okay, to where in 1998, we are almost at half of what we were in 1988. Could it be because the Soviet Union dissolved and because it became friendly between the US and Russia, and the Russia opened up to the West? Could it be that? I don't know. So anyway, we're at a low here in about 1999 at 360,000. Unfortunately, this graph only goes to 2014. Let's see. So we're at 323 in 2023. 323,000. That's not so far off from 10 years ago. It's really not. It's in the ballpark of what the last 20, 25 years have been, and it has hardly tapered off since the Cold War ended. It dropped down after the Cold War, and it's pretty much stabilized. So his comment is misleading, very misleading, when it's taken out of context. When it's taken out of context that, yes, we had high enlistment during the Vietnam War, we had high enlistment post-World War II, and the height of the communist Red Scare throughout the country. Of course we did. And towards the kind of last phase of the Cold War in the 80s and the 90s, when we had the highest military spending of any time in history, of course they were a little higher. They were, pretty significantly higher. And of course they dropped down after the Cold War ended and we entered this kind of modern era. And they've kind of stabilized at 300,000, a little over 300,000. So yeah, at face value to the casual listener, we're at the lowest numbers in its 76-year history. True, but if we look at the context, that's really not surprising. It's really not surprising. And to go to the commentator's comment, Americans will be so surprised. Are you surprised? I'm not really that surprised about that, and I'm not surprised about the other things that he's arguing as well. The next place that we would want to take this inquiry to see if his argument holds merit. Oh, is our army too small? Is our military too small? Have we decreased so much over the last 30 years that like we don't even stand up to these other major powers that are our adversaries? Let's look at it. Looking at 2022 numbers, which haven't changed much in last year, they're roughly about the same. The U.S. had 1.3 million active military personnel out of a population of 333 million. Now, China, who's one of the big enemy, right? One of the big enemies, they have 2 million active military personnel. So, 700,000 more than us. 1.3 million, 2 million. Oh, all right, there's a bit of a gap there. But of course, China's population is 1.43 billion. Okay? 1.43 billion. And their military is 2 million. We're almost at 2 million. 1.3 is not too far off from 2. And we only have 330 million people. So if we crunch the numbers on that, adjusted for population size, our military enlistment in relation to our population, adjusted for that, is 178% higher than China's. That's not bad. Not bad, really, right? Especially given that China is essentially, in a large part, is really an authoritarian state. It's not a democratic republic like we attempt to have here, or at least have on paper. So even with that, with all the rights that we have in the Constitution, even with China having a huge population, clearly being militaristic, clearly having no shame in being an authoritarian state, we have a 178% higher rate of enlisted military personnel. What about Russia? What about the other big bad enemy? Russia only has 830,000 military. So we've clearly got them outnumbered, at least, but they have a smaller population out of a population of 144 million. So Russia, when we compare to the US in terms of percentage of the population that's in the army, they have 49% more higher rate than the US. That is still not bad, especially given how Russia is also essentially an authoritarian regime. For the most part, citizens have limited rights and they can easily be forced into the military. And so it's not that bad when we think about it like that. Not to mention, we've got them matched and a little more in terms of having the same numbers of military personnel. Let's think about the other threats that could be people that would be aggressive to us, that we would need to deter, that our capability to do so has eroded significantly over the last 30 years. Let's think about like Hezbollah, okay? According to the Institute for Strategic Studies, they have about 20,000 soldiers. With their leader, who knows if he's exaggerating or what, he's estimating that it's at about 100,000, okay? So even if they have 100,000, we've got 1.3 million, and we've got the most nuclear warheads in the world. I just am not seeing how our ability to deter an attack from Hezbollah against the United States has been eroded. I'm just not seeing it. I think we could wipe them out with one drone strike or something like that. Maybe not one, but you get my point. What about Hamas? They are the aggressors in this attack on Israel and this whole recent war that we're getting drummed up to join now and for the American people to get behind. Hamas estimates are that they have about 50,000 soldiers. Yeah. So I don't know. What do you think? Like, does our 1.3 million numbers of military personnel to their 50,000, does it seem like we're not capable of deterring aggression? Does our nuclear stockpile and all of our other technology and the $830 billion we put into our defense system, is that not able to squash that 50,000? Because if it's not, and we're spending all this money, man, something really bad's going on. We need like a total overhaul of this system. Like, somebody's raking in all this money if we can't put out a group of 50,000. Not to mention, and we'll get to this later, Hamas is not stating an attack on the West and stating an attack on the United States. Sure, there might be factions that are championing behind the idea of jihad, but like, do you really think that Hamas is going to try to like conquer the U.S.? Like, they would be stupid. Clearly, they and if you listen to one of the officials that did an interview, they just want their independence. They just want to take back their area in Palestine. They don't want to attack the United States. Like that would be ridiculous. What about Iran? Okay, let's look at like a bigger, more formidable country. All right, we want to be able to deter their aggression, right? We got to deter their aggression. We've already seen war hawks commenting that Iran is behind this without providing any evidence, drumming up this public support and drumming up congressional support for this idea of Iran is to blame for this. We better focus on Iran. We better take action in Iran, whatever that would look like. Iran's got 610,000 personnel, so a little less than half of what we have. So even though it's been, again, eroding, our ability to deter aggression has been eroding over the last 30 years, we still have one of our biggest, the most formidable, really, enemy in the Middle East. Iran is half the size of our military. It seems that Iran doesn't even have nuclear weapons officially. At the time of this article, their plan was to create 8 to 10. Let me reiterate that to you. Iran, our most formidable, arguably, enemy that could really stage any kind of real threat to the United States, even though it wouldn't be, has, I don't even know, they maybe have 0 today, but their plan was to have 8 to 10. 8 to 10, and we have 5,200 something. How are we not capable of deterring aggression for them? I think that fact alone deters aggression. I think they're well aware that we could just obliterate them if they took any direct aggression against the United States. Do we need proof for that? Well, yeah, Iran is definitely this big threat that we need to deter aggression on because, oh yeah, it wasn't that long ago that we bombed Iran with a drone, by the way, not a B-52, which we're going to get to his argument about B-52s in a second and how weak that argument is, even though to the average listener, it seems like, oh, wow, that's a really interesting point. Fact. We bombed Iran 3 years ago in 2020, and we killed a national hero of theirs, a high military general, literally national hero, General Soleimani. And yeah, you know what Iran did back to the U.S.? Nothing. They didn't do anything. There was no retaliation of armed forces, no significant retaliation of armed forces. So you see the irony here? We bombed Iran and killed their national hero 3 years ago with a drone, with an automatically piloted bomb, and they did nothing back to us. Yet our capability to deter aggression has eroded. But our ability to be aggressive and deliver aggression, I guess that's just top notch, right? That we would have to believe that. So I think we've thoroughly disproven there the any significance to his technically true fact that the population of the Air Force, the number of active enlisted Air Force personnel, is the lowest in its history. It's true. But when we look at the full context of everything we just dove into, I think we made a pretty strong argument that that's not significant with relation to our ability to deter aggression. Now, let's hear his argument about the age of our pilots.
The youngest B-52 bomber is over 62 years old. We're flying trainers that are over 50 years old and fighters over 40. So today, the U.S. military struggles to meet demands in one theater, let alone 4. And by that, I mean defending our own homeland, what's going on in Europe, the Pacific, and now a hot war in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So he's saying, did you know that our youngest pilot for the B-52s is over 62? That's pretty wild to hear that, right? But if we don't understand what the B-52 is and we don't take into context its significance in making our country safe and deterring aggression, to use his words again, then it's really a meaningless statement. And all it does is really just rile up people to go, oh, wow, that's crazy. Like, we better get more people, better get younger people in the Air Force. We better get serious, like, or we're not ready for this. That's what it probably is designed to instigate in people. Let's look into the B-52 issue here. And I kind of went a little deep on it because it's pretty interesting. So I don't want to spend too much time here. But Let's think about why the youngest B-52 pilots are over 62. Could it be because the B-52 was an aircraft that was designed and initiated in the 1950s? Would there maybe be a connection there? Doing some preliminary research, you can go down much deeper rabbit holes, but I was able to find an article here from the Arms Control Association. They claim to be a national nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to promoting public understanding of and support for effective arms control policies. We provide policymakers, the press, and the interested public with authoritative information, analysis, and commentary on arms control proposals, negotiations, agreements, and related national security issues. So, reading this article, number one, it seems like they really are a trustworthy source and that they are kind of neutral. And if you read the article about the B-52s, it seems to try to be like a pretty objective history of it. And if anything, it's leaning towards pro-military, like pro-investing in weapons. Okay. So I use this as my source to see if his claim about the B-52 pilots being 62 years or older, if that's important or a reason to support military increases in our efforts to aid our allies in Ukraine and Israel. The primary function of the B-52 was to drop nuclear bombs. That's what the B-52 was designed for. How many times have we dropped nuclear bombs in the history of the United States military? Twice. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And do you know what happened when we dropped these bombs? An estimated 200,000 people, over 200,000 people, were killed, murdered by the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on Japan, who was ready to surrender. And there's documents to corroborate that, to prove that there had been negotiation and peace treaties already worked out. Japan was not planning to attack. The war was over. We have strong evidence to support that argument. You can also find the source of that in the Blank Checkbook. Very well sourced book. I think it won like an award for how well it was sourced as accurate information. Of those 200,000 plus people, it's estimated that 95% of those casualties were innocent civilians, not soldiers. So the B-52, what this guy's arguing that, it's terrible that our pilots that still can fly the B-52s are all over 62 years old. Now, we didn't use a B-52 for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. It wasn't there yet, but that's what it was designed to do, was to drop nuclear bombs, better ones than the ones at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So 95% of those 200,000 deaths were innocent civilians, among them children. There hasn't been any large-scale estimates that I found in my research, but I found one source saying that a safe estimate is about 20,000 at least children, innocent children, killed when we used the only time in history that nuclear bombs have ever been used. 20,000 children murdered by the United States. They didn't do anything, these children, okay? Many of them were at schools and at childcare facilities when the bombs hit. The irony in now kind of propping up how horrible it is that children are dying in Gaza because of Hamas's aggression, and that certainly is. And I don't condone any kind of violence or aggression of that nature, but the irony is that we did it back then, and it's like, whatever. We killed 20,000 innocent children when we didn't need to. Whatever, right? It's just it's kind of ridiculous, and we can go into all this off of his comment, his rhetoric that's designed to warmonger by saying, "Wow, our B-52 pilots are 62 years old." And yeah, I mean, if we look at the attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that not terrorism? I mean, 200,000 innocent civilians, like tens of thousands of children, is that not terrorism? I mean, was the U.S. a terrorist organization back then? Like, what's our standard here? It's like a double standard. I don't know. Is it really a big problem that the ones who fly our aircraft that's designed primarily for dropping nuclear bombs, which we've only used twice, and you see what they've did, something I'd hope we'd never want to do again. And even if we did have to do it, that's the end of the world there. That's the mutually assured destruction scenario. Is it that big of a deal that they're over 62 years old? Could it be that they're prioritizing all the other more modern and more heavily used technology? Surely we didn't use a B-52 to bomb Iran 3 years ago. We used a drone, okay? And you can dive a lot deeper, and that's what this article did. I was trying to find out, like, are the B-52s still important? Because if they're not that important, then that would make sense why the Air Force would like delegate the older guys to piloting them. That would make sense. And surely this article did confirm that. Here it says that basically after the Reagan years, from the Reagan years onward, ICBMs and SLBMs, basically missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they don't require someone driving and dropping off a bomb there. Like that's just like kind of an old school thing. They overtook the B-52s as the primary systems for delivering nuclear weapons. They're considered more reliable and survivable than the long-range bombers, the B-52s, and can deliver their warheads with far greater accuracy. Even so, the buffs, which means the B-52s, were retained in strategic arsenal partly because of continued political sway of the Strategic Air Command and its successor organization, the U.S. Strategic Command, partly because they provided senior officials with flexibility. Okay, so in other words, the B-52s became obsolete, but they kind of kept them on because of like political pressure and because like, all right, maybe it would be useful to like hand drive some bombs sometimes. And we'll see how they use them now. As the reporter said, I bet Americans will be really surprised about these facts. Now that we're getting into the context of it, are you that surprised that the old guys are driving these things? I'm not that surprised. It kind of makes sense. This article goes on to tell us that the B-52 was largely sidelined during the War on Terror. So we're talking recent modern times. However, in 2018, there's been this push for upgrading and replacing it as a reason for needing to be able to respond to a large-scale threat like China or Russia, like a large-scale nuclear war. Again, if any type of nuclear war were to ever start, and all the countries know this, it's game over for humanity. So it's almost just like it's a silly like chess game that costs a lot of money, and we're not going to use these weapons unless we're ready to like destroy the world, which apparently we haven't been yet, and we've had these nuclear weapons for decades. This even led to a contract that where for Northrop Grumman, who's going to make like a modern version of the B-52 now. I guess that they were able to pull the political strings enough. It's going to be called the B-21 Raider. It's scheduled for 2022, but it seems like, according to the article, that's going to be pushed off. Nevertheless, the Air Force gave Rolls-Royce North America a $2.6 billion contract to exist the planes, the current B-52's engines, turbofan engines with a more modern type. Even with all this, are the B-52s used a lot? Are they important? Does it matter that they're 62 years old? Is that a reason to spend a bunch of money on Ukraine and Israel? Here's what this article tells us the B-52s do. The command regularly dispatches B-52s on long-range missions intended to demonstrate its capacity to support forward-deployed U.S. and allied forces by bringing an array of advanced conventional and nuclear weapons to bear on adversary forces. Okay, in other words, they use them as like a support mechanism. So like if they're putting forces out, troops out, like they'll use them to kind of trail them to just be like, hey, like we could drop these on you at any time. So, we're here, we got your back type of thing. On some occasions, these missions extend beyond training and reassuring allies, right? They're used for training too. That's one of their primary missions. So would it make sense that, all right, let's keep the old guys like off the front lines. Let's let them fly the old B-52s that they like, from their day, their heyday. Let's let those guys fly them. We're never going to drop a nuclear bomb, right? We're rarely going to really need to be using them to drop bombs now that we have these missiles and we have drones and all of that, right, which are just way more effective and accurate. So let's let these guys, do that. That makes sense to me. Training missions, okay, providing support, reassuring allies makes sense. But on the high end of what these older guys do in the B-52s, they intimidate potential adversaries. Okay. In such cases, B-52s engage in conspicuous simulated attack maneuvers in the vicinity of enemy cities and military installations. Okay. So basically they are used to bluff, really, right? They're used to like simulate attacks and kind of like bluff the enemy into being like, we can do this if if we want to. So just remember that. Sounds like a pretty decent job for the 62 plus group. Although the B-52's function has contracted over the years, it remains today what it has been for 7 decades, a powerful symbol of the U.S. long-range strike capability. Through sheer size, conspicuous appearance, and the ability to deliver massive loads of ordnance, the bomber immediately connotes an incipient potential to inflict catastrophic harm on those who run afoul of U.S. and allied security interests, aka, again, it's this symbol can be used as a card to bluff, like, hey, like, remember, we can do this, you know we can drop these on you. No wonder that the Air Force deployed these B-52s to Fairfield on February 10th as Russia prepared to undertake what proved to be the largest land war in Europe. So yeah, again, it was used as a symbol, like they said. Now that we see his comment, wow, our B-52 pilots are old, hopefully you'll see now how that really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Any kind of significant bombing there are better ways of doing it than hand driving bombs and dropping them down. We've only done it twice in our history. And yes, the B-52s, the old B-52s, are used for dropping other types of bombs now, but they're one of the ways, and they're definitely not the preferred way. I think that we've pretty much torn apart everything that this gentleman said. Let's hear him out for the last segment here.
The real point here is if Ukraine and Israel are not supported, and as a result, they fail, the United States and Europe will be engaged in a full-up war shortly thereafter.
I mean, he's reading from a statement that somebody wrote with a clear intention to have a certain effect on the public who's meant to watch this and listen to it. Of course, right? That's the audience. And he's saying if Ukraine and Israel fails in their wars, it will force the United States and Europe to go on to a full-on war. But I'm not seeing how that is logically valid. Okay, so let's look at Israel first. You've got an independent rebellion basically going on of a group of 50,000 soldiers, Hamas. Okay, let's say Israel loses the war, says, all right, you know what? It's too much. Hamas, like, you can take back, you can have the territory, you can be independent. Why would that imply that the US and Europe would need to go into a full-on war? Okay, this is Israel and Palestine's the problem, really. We're involved with it because we're allies to Israel. But if Hamas was to win, what threat do they really pose to the United States? Is this group of 50,000, this grassroots militant group of 50,000, are they going to like come conquer and like destroy the U.S.? I really don't think so. I think they're well aware that like they wouldn't dare to take on the U.S. military with the amount of, nuclear stockpiles and just technology and just sheer force that we have. No chance. So I don't see how he is coming to that conclusion. And with Russia and Ukraine, sure, Russia would be much more formidable opponent than Hamas. But if Ukraine has to give up and say, okay, now Russia can govern this area, it's theirs. I also don't see how it's the deduction from that is that then the US and Europe have to enter a full-on war. Why? That's unfortunate for Ukraine, and certainly the UN should do what it what it wants to do and say, hey, look, like this is not right. This should have all been solved with diplomacy and could have been solved with diplomacy. So it gets masked as, oh, we have to do something because it's a humanitarian crisis, but it's really not that. It's really just warmongering and racketeering for war profits. If we look at it with any rational sense, it's clearly that. Why would Russia gaining this little territory require the United States to go on a full-on war, and Europe to go on a full-on war against Russia? I just don't see how that follows, but it's an effective rhetoric to get the average person to say, oh, I see what you're saying. Like, if we don't help them and they lose us, then like we're just going to be in a bigger war where we're going to have to like go all in, and it's going to be like World War III. It's going to be crazy. Like, so we might as well like help them now to like win these little wars, right? Which on paper to the average casual listener, it's like, okay, I see why we got to do that. I'm not going to really dig into it anymore because I don't have time like most of us do, because we're basically just we're chained to jobs and responsibilities, and trying to get through the day to day. We don't have time to really research this stuff. So I think his statement's invalid. Lastly, here to wrap it up, a kind of very puzzling statement that he makes here at the end. Let's listen.
So empowering our allies who have existential interests in indigenous knowledge in the regions or of the regions involved is really the smartest approach.
I'm lost here. Maybe you can know what the heck he's talking about. Let's try to get that down. I tried to listen to the word several times. I don't know what he's saying. It sounds like he's saying exist essential, or existential. It sounds like he could be saying existential. I don't know if he meant essential. It's really hard to tell, but he says our allies who have existential indigenous knowledge in the regions of involved. He said in first and then corrects himself and says, or of the regions involved, is really the smartest approach. Like, what on earth does that mean? I don't know what he's talking about. I guess on the one hand, I could assume that he means they know, our allies know, like what the history is there and like what needs to happen. And so they have the knowledge of it. So we should support them, which that would be a totally false claim, because if you actually look at the history and study it objectively by the facts, there's clearly knowledge of the history there of its very questionable situation in both instances. And the U.S. has a hand in making it dysfunctional as it is. And that's not a wild, radical theory. That is just a simple conclusion based on some simple facts. If you care to find them, if you care to look at the actual histories and really look at the work of historians that use primary documents of the primary actors in international policy in the Middle East and throughout the world, that just make it like, oh, that's why they did that. And they did that because it's like they're saying that in official documents, or they're saying it on the record. So again, on a more out there note, for those of you who might be interested in the more out there theories about secret knowledge around the world and maybe ancient knowledge that's been kind of guarded, was this like a little slip in there to people that are maybe in the know? Was this like a little message? I mean, this guy is like Air Force intelligence. He has a pretty in the secret realms of the power structure background. What was he? He was they said at the beginning, he was definitely like head of Air Force intelligence. So some of these shadier groups, was that like a little code to people? Because he said existential interests in the indigenous knowledge of the regions involved. I don't know, maybe on some real off key, he's talking about like some whole other thing, like that they're trying to get hold of, like maybe some ancient knowledge in some of these areas. But I don't know about that. That could just be coincidence, and of course it's just my imagination having some fun. And last, what do they send us off here with? But let's hear the beautiful news at the end here.
In indigenous knowledge.
And we know that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned of a long war and road ahead.
Long war, long road ahead. Sure. It's gonna meaning we're gonna really milk out the funding for this war.
The IDF experts that we've talked to this morning have said they're prepared to fight for as long as it takes.
They're prepared to fight for as long as it takes. Hey, we will drag this thing out as long as it takes, because you know what? Everybody's getting rich off it.
I know this is not the last time we'll have you on, Lieutenant General David Deptula. Thank you so much.
Great. So, they're going to have this guy back to give some misleading facts that are meant to make you think a certain way. But when you actually look at them in the context of what they mean and their significance towards our ability to defend ourselves, our ability to be a nation that's safe and that carries itself with integrity throughout the world, they really have virtually very little significance in that ability. They're going to have him back to do that more. I'm kind of disappointed with NewsNation. I mean, it is what it is. I guess they're pretty mainstream at this point. I thought that they were kind of like more independent. This just to me is like straight up propaganda, straight up war mongering. I guess you got to present all opinions. Don't know what you all think. This was quite a rant, and I definitely don't expect it to go this long. So I gotta learn how to kind of cut these things down. But it seems like there's just like so much detail. I tried to whittle it down as much as possible. So stay informed. Don't get misled. Don't, we gotta wake up to these things. Like, we're being played with by all these media. And this is an independent media outlet that's like prides themselves on trying to be neutral and trying to like bypass the big mainstream medias that are controlled by a small group of corporate entities. So imagine, what they're saying, and I can't even go down that rabbit hole. This just popped up to me and I couldn't help it. I was like, I gotta dig into this guy right now and just expose how manipulative that rhetoric is. So hopefully that will help you. We got some other things going on, actually some recent UFO news in the last day. I'll hopefully be presenting some of my insights on that. Stay positive. I think everything's going to work out, but it's kind of an ugly time we're going through right now. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.